The autumn of 1941 brought a terrifying, palpable dread to the heart of the Soviet Union. Operation Typhoon, the Nazi German offensive aimed at capturing Moscow, had reached its absolute zenith. The Wehrmacht spearheads, tired but relentless, were now visible on the immediate horizon of the capital city. Artillery fire from German guns could be heard clearly by the residents of the Kremlin, a chilling sound of imminent catastrophe. Panic threatened to break the morale of the civilian population as government officials and factories were secretly evacuated to the east. Rail lines were choked with desperate refugees and precious industrial equipment attempting to escape the German advance. Joseph Stalin himself briefly considered leaving the capital, a strategic move that would have signaled utter defeat to the world. He remained, however, choosing a perilous and dramatic stand that defied all military logic of the moment. The Soviet defense lines were thin, often comprising poorly trained militia and raw recruits thrown hastily into the brutal fight. These defenders were ordered to hold every inch of ground, facing a highly professional and battle-hardened German army. The entire fate of the vast nation seemed to hinge upon the survival of this one symbolic city. Its fall would almost certainly lead to the collapse of all centralized resistance, shattering the Soviet ability to wage war. The world watched with bated breath, convinced that the end of the Soviet state was a matter of mere days or weeks away. The cold was beginning to bite fiercely, a cruel, early winter that offered a small respite but demanded an immense human toll. This was the climate of fear and desperation into which a vital, unexpected moment of defiance was about to be injected. The question was no longer if the city would fall, but when the final German assault would breach the city's last defenses. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds and the proximity of disaster, a secret, bold plan was already in motion. This plan was a calculated gamble by Stalin, designed to project an image of unshakable resolve to the world and his own people. The capital was a fortress on the brink, and its leader was preparing a message for history itself. The severity of the crisis necessitated an act of leadership so profound it would either inspire victory or accompany total ruin. The desperate fighting in the freezing mud and snow defined the harsh reality of the Eastern Front's opening act. The city waited, frozen, as the greatest test of Soviet will approached its terrifying conclusion. Adolf Hitler had been absolutely convinced that the Soviet Union would collapse before the onset of the coming winter. His lightning war strategy, the Blitzkrieg, had proven devastatingly effective across Western Europe in the preceding years. The initial invasion, Operation Barbarossa, had achieved stunning successes, capturing millions of Soviet soldiers and vast territories. German forces had advanced hundreds of miles in mere months, appearing unstoppable in their rapid, destructive progress. They viewed the entire campaign as a racial struggle against the Slavic subhumans and the Judeo-Bolshevik regime. This profound arrogance contributed to a dangerous underestimation of both the Soviet capacity for suffering and their industrial power. German soldiers, who had expected to be marching in victory through Moscow by early autumn, were now facing severe logistics failures. Their supply lines, stretched to an impossible breaking point, struggled to keep pace with the swift, initial advance. The roads became quagmires of mud following the autumn rains, immobilizing vehicles and heavy artillery. This unforeseen logistical nightmare severely delayed the final, decisive thrust towards the Soviet capital. Despite these setbacks, the propaganda machine in Berlin continued to celebrate the campaign as a near-complete success. Hitler often spoke of the Soviet resistance in purely dismissive terms, assuring his generals that the enemy was spent. The German High Command was planning its winter quarters and even preparing for a celebratory parade on Red Square. Maps in Berlin showed the Battle of Moscow as a foregone conclusion, a mere formality before the war's end. The failure to equip German troops with adequate winter gear was a direct result of this short-sighted and overconfident planning. They believed the war would be decisively won before the severe Russian winter could even begin to take hold. The harshness of the weather, however, became an immediate and deeply detrimental factor for the advancing armies. German troops suffered terribly from frostbite and exposure as temperatures plunged dramatically below freezing. Their engines and vehicles failed to start in the extreme cold, rendering entire armored divisions immobile. The hubris of the initial, easy victories was now yielding a terrible and unexpected price on the Eastern Front. The myth of German invincibility was about to be tested against the Soviet will and the elements. This unwavering belief in their inevitable triumph made the shock of Moscow's defense all the more profound. The entire strategic vision rested upon a quick, catastrophic Soviet defeat which was now slipping irrevocably away. The days preceding November 7 were arguably the darkest and most perilous in Joseph Stalin's entire political career. He had initially reacted to the German invasion with shock and a period of near catatonic withdrawal, isolating himself completely. By the time the crisis deepened at Moscow's gates, he had regained his iron composure but remained cloistered in his Kremlin bunker. The bunker, heavily fortified and deep underground, provided both physical security and a necessary distance for critical thought. It was here that Stalin, the man of steel, faced the terrifying possibility of his totalitarian regime's total collapse. He received grim reports from the front lines detailing the massive casualties and the rapidly shrinking perimeter of the city's defense. His immediate circle of generals and commissars were under immense, suffocating pressure to deliver positive news. The atmosphere in the bunker was one of severe tension, dominated by the leader's suspicious and demanding presence. He had personally overseen the scorched earth policy, ordering the destruction of anything that could aid the advancing enemy. This included the removal of food supplies, housing, and industrial infrastructure across a vast stretch of territory. The decision to remain in Moscow, rather than evacuate to the safety of Kuybyshev, was his alone and deeply significant. This choice was a vital commitment, signaling to his people and the world that he would share the fate of the capital. He understood the immense psychological weight that his physical departure would place upon the remaining defenders. The silence of the bunker was often punctuated by the distant rumble of German artillery, a constant reminder of the stakes. He meticulously reviewed troop movements and supply allocations, micromanaging the desperate defense with brutal efficiency. The preparations for the secret parade were conducted under the strictest veil of secrecy and operational security. Only a few trusted lieutenants were privy to the highly risky plan to stage a military display on the symbolic holiday. Stalin's political survival, and the survival of the Soviet Union, were utterly intertwined in that freezing, dark subterranean space. His every order carried the weight of life and death for countless soldiers and civilians fighting outside. The pressure cooker environment forged a new, ruthless focus for the Soviet leader, hardening his resolve even further. He prepared his speech not just as a morale booster, but as a defining political statement against the German threat. The time for retreat was over. The time for a defiant and dramatic stand had finally arrived. November 7 was traditionally the most sacred and politically significant date on the Soviet calendar. It marked the anniversary of the 1917 October Revolution, the foundational moment of the entire communist state. Every year, a massive military parade was held on Red Square, showcasing the military might of the Soviet forces. In 1941, with German forces only a few dozen miles away, holding the parade seemed a gesture of sheer madness. The area was well within the operational range of German bombers and long-range artillery units. Cancelling the event would have been an undeniable sign of panic and a massive propaganda victory for the Nazis. Stalin made the dramatic and highly risky decision that the parade would go ahead as scheduled, defying all expectations. The planning was meticulous, shrouded in secrecy to prevent any intelligence leaks to the German High Command. Troops who were to participate were only informed of their destination at the very last possible moment. They marched onto the square straight from the front lines, many caked in the mud and grime of the recent fighting. The atmosphere was electric with tension, a mix of fear, determination, and immense national pride. Heavy anti-aircraft defenses were secretly deployed around the city center to deter any potential German air raid. The traditional civilian spectators were noticeably absent, replaced by a tense assembly of party officials and high-ranking military staff. The air was bitterly cold, and the entire square was covered in a thin, dusting layer of fresh, crisp snow. The symbolic value of the event could not be overstated, representing a defiant continuation of government business. It was a public act of utter refusal to concede to the pressure and proximity of the Nazi invaders. Atop the Lenin mausoleum, Joseph Stalin appeared, breaking his isolation to stand as a beacon of resistance. His presence there, exposed and visible to the troops, was a potent psychological weapon against fear. The parade itself was brief but powerful, a display of unyielding discipline and military commitment under fire. The world's media was present, sending the powerful, visual message that the Soviet state still stood firm and unbroken. The spectacle was designed to project absolute normalcy amidst the absolute chaos of the surrounding war zone. This single, defiant event became the pivotal morale point of the entire devastating Battle of Moscow. The advance of the German armies was ultimately stalled not just by Soviet resistance, but by the relentless Russian climate. The early onset of the severe winter of 1941 to 1942 proved to be a decisive, non-human adversary to the Wehrmacht. Temperatures plummeted to extreme lows, often reaching -40 degrees Celsius in the areas surrounding the capital. German tanks and vehicles, designed for campaigns in milder climates, froze solid and became completely inoperable. Lubricating oils turned to a thick, useless sludge, rendering complex machinery utterly useless and dead in the snow. The soldiers themselves were dangerously under-equipped, having only their standard-issue uniforms for protection. Frostbite became a rampant and debilitating injury, resulting in thousands of casualties and widespread demoralization. Many German soldiers resorted to desperate measures, even lighting fires beneath tanks in futile attempts to warm the engines. The Soviets, meanwhile, were far better prepared, utilizing padded winter uniforms, felt boots, and specialized equipment. Their equipment was designed to handle the extremes of their native climate, giving them a critical tactical advantage. The term General Winter became a grim reality for the overstretched and freezing German army units. The intense cold severely hampered the effectiveness of their superior air support, grounding many German aircraft. Wounded soldiers faced an almost certain death sentence if they could not be quickly evacuated from the brutal, open fields. The psychological impact of the cold was as severe as the physical damage, crushing the offensive spirit of the troops. This relentless, debilitating climate turned the German blitzkrieg into a grinding, frozen war of attrition. The logistical genius of the German military could not overcome the simple, devastating power of the Russian elements. Hitler's confidence that the war would end before winter proved to be one of his most catastrophic strategic errors. The snow-covered terrain also limited visibility and complicated the already chaotic movements of large military formations. Every movement, every resupply mission, and every attack was made exponentially harder by the freezing conditions. The defense of Moscow was inextricably linked to the arrival of this powerful, unyielding force of nature. The cold gave the Soviet defenders precious weeks to reinforce, regroup, and prepare their eventual counterattack. Joseph Stalin's appearance on the Lenin Mausoleum on November 7 was a highly calculated and politically vital action. He broke his deliberate, prolonged period of isolation and silence to address the nation at its most perilous hour. His figure, bundled in a greatcoat and standing resolute on the tribune, was a potent symbol broadcast across the land. This physical presence was an act of profound courage, defying the very real threat of assassination or German air attack. He began his address with a calm, deliberate tone, seeking to inspire confidence rather than inflame raw emotion. The speech was masterfully crafted to serve multiple purposes: a morale boost, a strategic statement, and a call to arms. Stalin's main message was an absolute and uncompromising declaration that Moscow would not, under any circumstances, fall to the enemy. He framed the battle not merely as a military engagement, but as a fight for the very existence of the Russian people and their history. He spoke of the enemy's temporary success but emphasized the fundamental moral decay of the Nazi regime and its inevitable doom. His voice, though dry and often monotone, carried the immense weight of his absolute authority across the freezing square. He purposefully elevated the stakes, defining the war as a sacred national defense, not simply a Communist Party struggle. He called upon the deep, historical patriotism of the Russian people, transcending the ideological divisions of the previous decades. The soldiers marching past heard his words not through a radio, but directly from their supreme commander's lips. This immediate, physical connection between the leader and the fighting men was a moment of immense psychological power. Stalin's speech essentially served as a public and irrevocable commitment to fight the war to its ultimate, final conclusion. It was a final checkmate against the fear of a leadership capitulation that had been lingering in the minds of many. His words reinforced the idea that the heart of the Soviet state remained intact and that the government was still fully functional. The speech was brief, sharp, and entirely focused on the immediate task: the total destruction of the fascist invaders. This moment defined Stalin's leadership in the war, moving him from a distant dictator to the visible commander-in-chief. It was an undeniable performance of defiance, broadcast to both friend and foe across the entire world. The powerful image of the unbowed leader in the endangered capital became an enduring piece of Soviet mythology. A key rhetorical strategy in Stalin's November 7 address was the masterful invocation of Russia's legendary historical heroes. He deliberately shifted the narrative from a purely ideological conflict to a deep, patriotic war for the motherland. He directly referenced the great figures who had, in centuries past, successfully defended Russia against foreign invaders. Figures like Alexander Nevsky, who defeated the Teutonic Knights, were brought forward as spiritual patrons of the Red Army. He spoke of Dmitry Donskoy, the prince who led the fight against the Mongol yoke, establishing a long tradition of national defense. Kuzma Minin and Dmitry Pozharsky, the heroes who expelled Polish invaders during the time of troubles, were also solemnly mentioned. This invocation served to connect the current desperate struggle to a glorious, unbroken chain of Russian military tradition. It immediately transcended the often divisive Soviet ideology, appealing instead to a much older, deeper sense of national identity. By linking the current Red Army soldier to the exploits of these ancient heroes, he elevated the status of the common defender. The sacrifice being made on the frozen front lines was thus given profound historical and cultural meaning. This shift in rhetoric was crucial for uniting a diverse nation whose loyalty to the Communist Party was often tenuous. It transformed the war in the eyes of many from a political struggle into a necessary, sacred, and existential crusade. The soldiers were no longer just fighting for Bolshevism, they were fighting for Russia itself, for the soil of their ancestors. Stalin effectively borrowed the immense moral authority of these historical figures to reinforce his own position as a national leader. This strategy demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Russian history and the deep-seated pride of the Soviet populace. The names of the ancient heroes were meant to instill a sense of deep, righteous vengeance against the current invaders. This historical grounding provided a powerful counter-narrative to the German propaganda's dismissal of the Soviet state. The message was clear: Russia had endured and defeated powerful invaders before, and it would do so again now. This spiritual call to arms resonated deeply with the national consciousness, providing a transcendent reason to fight and die. The speech successfully tapped into the wellspring of historical resilience that the Soviet Union possessed in abundance. The memory of past victories became a powerful, living shield against the present despair and fear. The defense of Moscow was not solely a military operation, it was a vast, total effort involving the entire civilian population. Stalin's speech gave explicit recognition to this immense, collective power of the unconquered people's will. He acknowledged the profound sacrifices being made by workers, women, and older men who remained in the threatened city. These civilians were organized into militia units, construction brigades, and emergency defense workers in massive numbers. They toiled ceaselessly, digging anti-tank ditches, erecting roadblocks, and preparing the city for street-to-street combat. Factories that were not evacuated were hastily converted to produce armaments and supplies for the nearby front lines. Women and children were often responsible for maintaining vital rail lines and repairing bomb damage under severe duress. The will to resist manifested in countless acts of desperate, individual bravery and collective, organized defiance. Stalin's words were meant to solidify this civilian resolve, assuring them that their contribution was recognized and essential. He painted a stark picture of the brutal fate that awaited them under Nazi occupation, strengthening their determination to fight. The fear of German atrocities served as a powerful motivator, cementing the resolve to fight for their homes and families. The entire city effectively became a frontline fortification, manned by soldiers and civilians working in grim solidarity. The spirit of Otechestvenaya Voyna, the Great Patriotic War, was invoked to galvanize this mass civilian effort. This emphasis on the unity of the people and the army was a crucial element of the speech's psychological effect. It dissolved any lingering class or political divisions in the face of the overwhelming, existential foreign threat. The morale of the home front was just as critical as the number of tanks or the allocation of artillery shells. The successful organization of this civilian defense effort remains a testament to the Soviet system's capacity for total mobilization. The people's will was transformed into physical barriers and an unyielding, psychological wall against the German advance. The survival of Moscow depended fundamentally on this final, collective refusal to accept the possibility of defeat. Perhaps the most potent demonstration of Stalin's confidence was the immediate, tactical deployment of the parading forces. As the military columns reached the end of their ceremonial march across Red Square, they did not return to barracks. Instead, tanks, infantry, and field artillery units were immediately routed and driven directly towards the front lines. This direct transition from a grand, symbolic parade to the grim reality of combat was a powerful, stunning spectacle. It visually reinforced the urgency of the moment and the government's absolute seriousness about the city's defense. The symbolism was clear. The capital was so close to the fighting that a military parade was a mere stepping stone to the battlefield. For the soldiers, the experience was intense, marching for a political spectacle only to immediately face the enemy. The vehicles, often covered in the remnants of the ceremony's light snow, were soon caked in the mud and blood of battle. This move was not just a symbolic gesture, it represented a genuine, desperate injection of fresh manpower and equipment. The units deployed were often high-quality, elite forces that had been held in reserve for this critical moment. Their sudden arrival on the front lines provided a much-needed psychological and physical boost to the exhausted defenders. It caught the German intelligence and frontline commanders completely by surprise, upsetting their operational planning. The Wehrmacht had not anticipated the swift reinforcement of the Soviet defenses directly following the public display. This rapid deployment was a testament to the efficient, albeit brutal, Soviet military logistics and command structure. It was a crucial tactical move that contributed directly to stemming the final, powerful German thrust toward the city. The men who marched proudly through Red Square soon found themselves fighting for their lives in the freezing trenches. The parade was literally a momentary pause before the ultimate, decisive engagement for the capital's survival. The immediacy of the deployment transformed the ceremonial event into a critical piece of the tactical defense strategy. This single day saw the seamless and dramatic merger of political propaganda and raw, military necessity on the front. Stalin's November 7 speech was not intended only for the Soviet people and the soldiers in Red Square. It was a carefully crafted message aimed directly at the major Allied powers and the Nazi Axis enemies. The sheer audacity of holding the parade under the shadow of the German gun sent a powerful signal of Soviet endurance. To the Allies, primarily Great Britain and the United States, it served as a vital assurance that the Soviet Union was not broken. It demonstrated that the Eastern Front would hold, tying up the vast majority of German military resources indefinitely. This image of unyielding Russian defiance was essential for securing continued material aid and lend-lease support from the West. The fact that Moscow's leadership was still present and fighting debunked German propaganda claiming the city had already fallen. To the German High Command, the speech and the parade were an unexpected, frustrating spectacle of Soviet resilience. It shattered their deep-seated belief in a swift, total collapse of the Soviet state's political and military will. The event forced the German military to reassess its planning, realizing the war would not be over before Christmas. It served as a public commitment that the Soviet Union would not entertain any talk of a separate peace agreement. This broadcast of defiance solidified the Western perception of Stalin as a determined, if ruthless, leader in the anti-Axis coalition. It provided a much-needed morale boost to resistance movements and occupied populations across all of Europe. The image of the Red Army marching past the Kremlin gave hope to millions suffering under the Nazi yoke elsewhere. It demonstrated that resistance was possible, even against the seemingly unstoppable force of the German war machine. The speech was carefully translated and broadcast globally, becoming a powerful piece of counter-propaganda against the Nazis. This single public action managed to shift the psychological balance of the war in the international arena. It confirmed that the fight was far from over and that the Allies had a robust, committed partner in the Soviet Union. The entire Red Square event became a global media moment, a testament to the ultimate power of defiance and survival. The holding of the parade and the accompanying speech coincided precisely with the strategic climax of the Battle of Moscow. This moment marked the absolute, high-water mark of the entire German invasion of the Soviet Union up to that point. The Wehrmacht's final, exhausted efforts to seize the capital were already beginning to falter due to weather and resistance. Stalin's defiance was the final psychological blow that confirmed the failure of Operation Typhoon's initial aims. Crucially, the Soviet command had been secretly assembling fresh, highly effective reserve forces in the deep hinterland. These forces included well-trained Siberian divisions, uniquely adapted and equipped for the brutal winter fighting. While Stalin spoke, the final preparations for a massive, coordinated counteroffensive were already being finalized behind the lines. The speech's effect was to buy the necessary time and psychological cover for this strategic military maneuver to commence. Within a month of the Red Square parade, the Soviet forces launched their massive counterattack, pushing the Germans back. This counteroffensive was the first major, large-scale defeat suffered by the German army since the war began. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and provided the Allies with their first genuine taste of strategic success. The Soviet counterattack was brutal, effective, and fully capitalized on the German logistical and climate-related failures. The Wehrmacht was forced into an unexpected and ill-prepared defensive posture in the depths of the Russian winter. The battle shifted from a defense of the capital to an aggressive campaign to push the invaders hundreds of miles back. Stalin's address, therefore, was the political prelude to a dramatic and decisive military turning point in the war. It was the moment when the initiative on the Eastern Front began its slow, inevitable shift from Berlin to Moscow. The defense of the city was not merely a local victory, it guaranteed the continued long-term survival of the Soviet Union. The success of the counteroffensive proved that the Soviet capacity to fight, endure, and strike back was intact. This pivotal moment ensured that Germany would be permanently engaged in a two-front war of attrition. The defense of Moscow and Stalin's defiant November 7 speech left an indelible, profound legacy on the course of World War II. The single fact that Moscow did not fall in 1941 irrevocably altered the trajectory of the entire global conflict. It forced Adolf Hitler into a prolonged, costly, and ultimately unwinnable war of attrition on the immense Eastern Front. The Soviet victory ensured the continued existence of the Allied coalition and prevented a potential Axis victory. Stalin's speech remains a legendary, enduring piece of Soviet military and political mythology to this very day. It is remembered as the precise moment when the nation rallied its spirit and confirmed its absolute refusal to surrender. The image of the troops marching directly from the parade to the battlefield has become an iconic, powerful symbol of sacrifice. The city of Moscow was later given the prestigious title of Hero City to commemorate the extraordinary bravery of its defenders. The strategic failure at Moscow was the first in a series of devastating setbacks that ultimately doomed the German war effort. For Joseph Stalin, the event cemented his position as the unquestioned and unyielding wartime leader of the Soviet Union. His historical standing was transformed from that of a suspicious party dictator to the savior of the Russian nation. The speech provided a deep and lasting source of national pride, becoming a defining memory for an entire generation of Soviets. The immense human cost of the battle is also a sobering, necessary part of the legacy and historical reflection. Millions of lives were sacrificed on the freezing fields surrounding the capital in the brutal fighting of that winter. The defense of Moscow stands as a monumental testament to the sheer human capacity for endurance and collective determination. It demonstrated to the world the full, terrifying might of a mobilized Soviet state fighting for its ultimate survival. The memory of the speech continues to resonate in Russia, symbolizing the indomitable spirit of its people in times of existential crisis. The final, powerful message is that of an unconquered capital, a city that refused to yield and changed history forever.